Hello and welcome back to 96.5 NFM. My name is Christopher Jones and I'm joined by my brother Matthew. Last year, Matthew and I interviewed Bill Shorten, but today we have decided to get two politicians from the right of politics to balance out the discussion. Today we'll not only be joined by Corey Bernardi, but we currently have Dr. Rachel Carling-Jenkins from the Australian Conservative Party. Dr. Carling-Jenkins has a PhD in social science and she worked as an academic and a social worker. Carling-Jenkins is the author of Disability and Social Movements, which was published in November of 2014. Her inaugural parliamentary speech, she described herself as a social justice campaigner, committed to raising awareness about rights and care for the disabled and elderly amongst many other things. Dr. Carling-Jenkins, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Chris and Matthew.
It's our pleasure. Now, I'm going to ask you our first question, which is, generally when one enters politics, it is because one has a fascination with the political sphere. Were there any major events that triggered such a political fascination in you?
I worked in welfare for 20 years, Chris, before I started going into politics, and I think really it was a gradual awakening for me. The impact of legislation, the impact of policies and the impact of different levels of government were having on vulnerable people that I was working with.
Okay.
Then there was one major event, and that was a March for the Babies in 2013. That was quite significant for me. It was an event where I realised that legislation that thousands of people at the rally were calling for was not happening. So I made a commitment right then to enter politics and actually carry through the wishes of that group of people, and that's exactly what I've done.
It's Matthew here. Your bio on the Australian Conservatives Party website states, Rachel is passionate about seeing cultural change in the way women are valued in society. In what manner do you wish for society's value of women to change?
That's a great question, Matthew, and thank you for that. Couple of things I'd like to comment on there. One is that I'm what's called an abolitionist. So an abolitionist is a person who is against the prostitution movement and is anti-pornography. And I'm very strong on those two issues. I believe that both prostitution and pornography devalue women in our society. So I'm very committed to making sure that we have a porn-free society and that we have a society that is free from exploitation of women in the sex trade. The other area that I'm passionate about for women is motherhood. I believe that mothers have been devalued in society over the last few decades, and that's something I'm really passionate about working in. One example I'll give you, Matthew, is that I've been working on a perinatal care motion, so looking after mothers and their babies during the perinatal care period. And that's something that we're working on in Parliament with a group of cross-party MPs at the moment to ensure that mothers and their babies are looked after more appropriately in this state.
Excellent. Prior to joining Parliament in 2014, you were a social worker. What did that entail and what other jobs did you have?
Well, Chris, I worked in a variety of jobs in welfare. I started, in fact, I wanted to be a counsellor when I first finished uni, but I looked too young. So I ended up working in a disability employment agency. And through that, I just loved working with people with disabilities, and I never gave up that passion. And I worked for almost 20 years with people with disabilities and with people with mental health issues.
Your Wikipedia page mentioned that you were previously an academic as well. What precisely did you teach and for how long did you teach for?
You've really done your research, Matthew. Yes, I was an academic for quite a while. I was a research fellow, so I did quite a bit of research at a few universities. Probably for about 3 or 4 years I was an academic, and I taught into social work and occupational therapy programs around communication with people with disabilities, and I also taught around relating to people with disabilities into the medical professional field.
Brilliant. Now, education is an important aspect of our society. What policies do you suggest should be adopted to improve our education system?
Well, Chris, I think a lot of people are very discontent with our education system as it is. I have brought up 2 motions in Parliament in my time in Parliament, which were focused on giving power in education away from the government back to parents and students. I think that the role of parents, particularly in the primary school years, isn't being respected, particularly through our state school system at the moment, and that's why we've got programs like the Safe Schools program. But I also have parents complaining to me about some of the textbooks that their children are using, and that the fact that they don't have any input into that, either themselves or their children don't have input. And I think that's something that the community wants some better control. The community expect, and that's the community of parents and children and youth, expect to have input into the education system, and they also want to get back to basics. We don't want to be teaching ideology that's against what we believe, and teachers at the moment, I believe, too, are very overwhelmed with the breadth of subjects that they're needing to teach, and I've had a lot of complaints on that. Basically, I think we need to get back to basics and teach students what they need to know, and that's it.
What proposals do you support in order to reduce crime in Victoria?
Matthew, that's a really interesting topic at the moment, and we've been talking a lot about that, not just in the media, but a lot about that in Parliament. And one of the biggest problems we have is that our law and order system at the moment does not meet community expectations. And I think increasingly that is exactly what we need to do. So there needs to be an entire system overhaul of our police system, of our judicial system, of our bail system, to make sure that it's in line with community expectations.
I would like to go back to your life before entering politics. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your PhD?
I'd love to, Chris. As a former academic, I always love to talk about my research. So I studied the disability rights movement in Australia. It was the first PhD of its kind in Australia.
Okay.
And I studied the Indigenous rights movements, such as land rights, and the various women's liberation movements, so from the suffragettes right through to the second wave and the third wave feminists.
Mm-hmm.
And my proposal was that those movements were a lot stronger in consciousness raising in Australia compared to disability rights. So I worked a model out to analyse social movements through my PhD, which is now being used across the world to analyse social movements. And we looked for and identified the disability rights movement here in Australia.
Now, with any sort of scientific research, you sort of need a bit of a control to be able to measure something off. How did you measure that one thing was has been focused on as much as the other?
Disability is not as much in the public consciousness.
Okay.
So my research was documentary research. I found a wealth of documents that showed us from newspapers through to textbooks through to articles that there was a lot of consciousness around Indigenous rights and women's rights, but there were very few around disability rights, particularly Australian-based.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What would a day look like for an upper house MP?
Well, Matthew, hopefully you'll be one day and you'll be able to experience it for yourself. It's the best job, in my opinion. It's a very wide and varied job. If I'm in Parliament, it's long hours. We can work 12 to 14-hour days in Parliament, and we get to question the government, we get to bring motions, we get to debate legislation from the floor.
When you were doing, sorry to interrupt, but when you were
Chris.
doing, debating the euthanasia bill,
Yes.
weren't you in the upper house how many hours were you in the upper house debating that bill?
That's a very good point, Chris. We were in there for over 24 hours.
Oh, God.
That is very unusual. It's not unusual for us to work a 10 to 12-hour day, but it's very unusual for us to work 24 hours. So we did 2 24-hour shifts within a week debating the euthanasia bill.
They're very long days.
It was very exhausting.
And as a member for the Western Metropolitan Region, what is the number one most important thing that the region needs right now?
Right now, the region is calling out for a stop to the crime wave. The West is inundated with crime. The media can't keep up. We're getting some horrific examples of crime, and that's something that really needs to stop for the community to feel safe.
Does your duties differ significantly from MPs in the lower house?
It does actually, Matthew. In the lower house, that's where the government is formed, as you would know, and they concentrate more on governing getting legislation through a lot more quickly than we do. We're the House of Review in the upper house. We have a lot more time to scrutinise legislation. So whereas the lower house, even though they have 88 members, will pass a bill within perhaps 2.5 hours, just at a guess. In the upper house, that same bill might take an entire day for us to get through, because we actually interrogate the bill. We don't just speak to it, but we also interrogate it in what's called a committee process, where we have a minister answering all of our questions on the bill. It's a very important process because that's what the judges will look at when they're interpreting legislation. They actually look for what we call our Hansard, which is our transcript. They look at our Hansard and they figure out what the intent of legislation was. So it's our job, it's our duty in the upper house to be very thorough in that way.
Now, what result is your party aiming for in the upcoming Victorian election?
I'd like to add a few more Australian Conservatives to join me in the upper house.
Okay.
So we have 8 regions across Victoria. I think we're very competitive across the regions.
In January, it was announced that over 20 Conservative candidates will be running in the South Australian elections. Have you already chosen candidates for Victoria's upcoming state election? If not, when will such information be revealed?
Matthew, we haven't chosen all of our candidates yet, so we're not going to launch that until we do. At the moment, we're competing in the Batman by-election, and so we will be making our announcements probably around Easter this year.
Are there any issues or causes you'll be focusing on for the remainder of this Parliament's term? For example, crime, healthcare, education?
Sure, Chris. One of the things I'll be really concentrating on is finishing off the inquiry into perinatal care to ensure that the next government, whether it's Labor or Liberal, will have a blueprint for how to proceed to better look after mothers and their babies. The other issues that I'll be concentrating on will be law and order. Anyone who reads the papers would understand, or anyone who listens to the news would understand, that we're getting quite a bit of legislation through on law and order at the moment. So that's taking up quite a bit of my time. The other 2 issues that I'm concentrating on coming up to the next election are education, which we've spoken about, but also the energy crisis that's looming here in Victoria.
Where do you see your party's state branch in relation to the other major political parties in 10 years from now?
Matthew, Australian Conservatives is a major party in start-up mode. So I believe in 10 years' time, we will be in that major party category. Absolutely. I always like to remind people, though, that a week is a very long time in politics, so that could happen, well, a lot sooner than the 10-year mark.
Will the Conservative Party be contesting in local elections as well, or will they just be focusing on state, territory and federal elections?
Chris, we will be looking at local council elections because there are a lot of issues that are coming up there at the moment. Australia Day, for example, with a variety of councils across our great state deciding to cancel Australia Day celebrations. We're quite annoyed at that. We think that's wrong, and we will certainly be looking at electing local councillors in the future.
Cool. Thank you very much for coming in and speaking with us for about 15 minutes. It was lovely. We haven't had a politician in this booth before, so thank you very much for making our day.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Matthew.
You're welcome.